I was trying to pretend nothing was wrong. I sat in the conference room with everyone else, because you learn quickly that the safest thing is to keep your face neutral and your voice small. The financial projections glowed on the screen. Paper cups clinked. Someone laughed at a joke about quarterly targets. I held a pen like an anchor, my thumb worrying the cap until skin chafed. My chest felt too tight. My vision blurred around the edges, like ink bleeding into clean paper. Then the world narrowed to a single point of pressure at the base of my throat. Breath turned brittle. The floor tilted. My knees forgot what to do. I didn't go down slowly, as in the movies. It was sudden. One heartbeat, and gravity's polite warning failed. I remember my hands reaching for the table, the cheap veneer scraping my palms, the startled intake of the CFO behind me. Someone's chair scraped back. There was a sound inside my head like breaking glass. Then hands. Big hands. Not the gloved, polite hands of a man used to greeting shareholders. Not the careful, rehearsed hands of human resources. These were broad, warm, and utterly certain. They closed under my arms, at my ribs and back, and held me like they had been built for this exact thing. To catch falling things and not let go. "Stay with me," a voice said. It wasn't the same voice I had worked with over budget meetings and investor calls. It was lower, threaded with an authority that made the room tilt in a different way. It steadied me. I became aware of faces, my colleagues' mouths forming questions, and then stopping, because no one asked the man who had caught me a question. No one moved. The projector hummed on, oblivious. The only alive thing was the pressure of those hands and the heat of breath on my temple. He had saved me in a way that felt like being rescued from drowning, and then immediately dragged into daylight that showed all my bruises. When he drew me closer to examine my jaw and the pale crescent of a bruise behind my ear, his fingers brushed the soft place at the base of my skull, and I flinched. Not from pain this time, but from the revelation that someone had seen me fall and hadn't looked away. "Who did this?" he asked simply, like naming something could unmake it. My mouth worked. Words came out too small, useless. I could have lied. I could have said I tripped. I could have given them the bland corporate explanation. Fainted from fatigue. I was very practiced at small but lying would have left the bruise in me the same. David's name came out, as if it had its own weight. "David Morrison," I said. The name landed heavy in the air. The man who held me didn't blink. He only looked, and only then did the room begin to move again. People murmured. Someone reached for the phone on the table. A junior analyst I barely knew appeared at my knees with a pack of tissue. My ears rang. "Get her out of here," the man said. The room emptied with the kind of speed that only fear can produce. Chairs scraped, papers rustled, and then there was the click of the conference room door as it closed behind us. We were in a narrow corridor lit by fluorescence that made my skin go green. He guided me gently, as if my body was fragile but not helpless. Later I would think about that, careful balance his strength and his tenderness, and how both were dangerous. He didn't introduce himself. He had no tie clipped to his shirt that advertised his identity. People in our company would have called him the owner in whispers and added an inflection that made it sound like the name itself was hazardous. I knew of him by reputation, Marco Beraruce, a man who collected favors and loyalties like other people collected art. A man whose opinions could rearrange people's lives without him lifting a hand. I had never expected his hands to be the thing that steadied me. Samondante, I later learned, arrived at the door, a shadow with eyes that registered threats like a radar. He moved off to the side, allowing Marco to guide me to the car. The security detail had that practiced, muted brutality of people who knew how to make a moment disappear. There were no questions. There was an efficiency that felt like a blade wrapped in silk. They took me straight to Marco's penthouse. I know how that sentence reads, in novels. Suddenly elevated, draped in luxury, a temporary sanctuary. Real life rarely lines up so neatly with fiction. The elevator smelled faintly of lemon and something deeper, like pipe tobacco and leather. The penthouse itself was huge, all glass and angles, a view of the city like a map. It should have been cold. Instead, the space felt compressed around me as if the enormous rooms were trying to hold me from falling again. Marco sat me on a couch that seemed impossibly soft. He lifted my chin with one hand and gave me one of those looks that judges the map of you, wounds, hesitation, availability. It was careful and clinical and somehow intimate. Call a doctor, he said to Dante. There was a private physician on Marco's staff, someone who arrived with a black leather bag and a hospital efficiency. She had the repose of someone who'd seen too many emergency rooms to be surprised by anything. I didn't mind her examining me. At the moment, anyone who could translate pain into words felt like a blessing. The doctor took my history with professional calm. She asked where it hurt, what I had eaten, whether I'd lost consciousness and for how long. Her hands were steady as she palpated the bruise at my temple and traced a tender line from my collarbone. She prodded my wrist, checked my pupils with a small flashlight, listened to my lungs. Someone offered me water. The water came in a paper cup. The cup smelled like nothing plain and I clung to it like it was a talisman. When she found the fresh marks along my arm's fingers that had grabbed in anger, she frowned in a way that didn't need commentary. We need to document this, she told me. Photographs? A report? Are you wanting to report this to the police? I pictured David in the office, polite and leering, a man who had spent months crossing lines and making me perform small, private contortions to avoid his hands. I pictured the way he had cornered me once by the copier, the way he had said, "You owe me," as if it were an accounting note that could be balanced with compliance. But I also had a fear that a report would do little more than pin a blot on paper while he continued to haunt the thresholds of my calendars and emails. David's friendship with half the office meant HR would blink and offer an apology. That meant nothing. I wanted protection. I wanted to reclaim my life. But I wasn't naive. I knew the justice system was cold and slow and often indifferent to bruises that were only visible to the person who wore them. I knew that speaking might make the lines on my skin into a story that others would use to categorize me as weak, hysterical, or difficult. At the same time, silence felt like consent. It felt like walking around every day with a secret debt. I don't want police, I heard myself say. The words tasted like ash. Marco's jaw set There was a shift in him, a change from observing to deciding. He didn't reach for a feathered, diplomatic solution. He moved in a way that suggested he had other kinds of levers. Then we handle it, he said. There was no flourish to his words. They were an order dressed as an offer. Dante nodded. I'll make sure he leaves the city for a while, he said. A transfer. Somewhere they won't find his number. Those words were lethal and comforting at once. There was a ruthlessness baked into the phrasing, but there was also a shield. Marco's methods were not mine to approve or condemn in the abstract. They were a kind of immediate, private remedy to a public danger. And because he said it, because his voice had authority, it felt like safety landing on me, like a hand. The doctor performed her paperwork. She took photographs for documentation, wrote down the visible injuries, and then, after a careful exam and an X-ray that came back clean of fractures, she said words that felt like a hinge releasing. No broken bones, she said. Concussion signs are minimal. Rest, no work for at least 1 week. Hydration, no alcohol for 24 hours. If anything changes, come back immediately. Will she be able to work after that? Marco asked, voice low. Physically, yes. After a week, the doctor said. She paused, as if choosing her phrase for something beyond the medical. Psychologically, it's different. That will take longer, and it won't be linear. Support, therapy, a safe environment. These help. Marco didn't ask about therapy. He nodded and handed the papers to Dante with one of those quick instructions that left no place for debate. Marco's attention shifted to me again, like a tide coming back to shore. You shouldn't be here, he said. It wasn't a moral rebuke. It was a simple, immutable fact. I wanted to be angry. I wanted to tell him that I was a grown woman who could handle herself, that I didn't need someone to wrap me in security blankets stitched with other people's loyalty. But anger had become a tired animal inside me. It didn't have the energy to roar. Instead, I said, "Thank you." The word felt small in my mouth. It wasn't gratitude only for catching me. It was gratitude for the clarity that his arrival offered. There was someone who saw the bruise and did not look away. There was also a part of me that felt embarrassed. He had seen my body mapped with violence. That kind of exposure made you feel like a specimen. He made tea. He offered me a blanket. He sat near enough that his leg brushed mine and I shivered at the contact. His cologne leather and something herbal wrapped around me. He did not press. He did not demand. He observed. He asked questions that were practical and had an unspoken current of ownership. Where are you staying? Do you have someone who can check on you? Do you want me to speak with HR? When I said HR, a defensive reflex kicked. HR felt perfunctory, complicit. Marco's lips curved in a way that was almost a smile. I'll move you to a role near me, he said. Closer. Fewer people with access. More oversight. You'll report directly to me. The offer should have set off alarms. Promotion in exchange for proximity had a smell of trap. But the alternative, walking back into the office every day with the knowledge that David would still be there, was worse. It was like the choice between stepping again into a room with a loose wire or letting someone shore up the wiring without asking questions about why they'd come into your home. I thought of my apartment, a place that had become a collection of small, suffocating fears. The way my keys rattled, the way I flinched at knocks that mirrored David's footfalls. I thought of my career and the months of hard graft that had put me in proximity to people who could not be trusted. I thought of the meetings where I had sat and kept my head down and thought about deadlines because thinking about boundaries felt like a luxury. When I agreed, flanked by a doctor and a man who made power feel like a physical thing, my consent felt complicated. I said yes because I wanted to live without that quiet predator in my day. I said yes because I wanted to feel safe at my kitchen sink. I said yes because the alternative was a labyrinth of forms and questions and a legal system that might strip my privacy and offer me too late paper apologies. If you accept, Marco said, you won't be answerable to the people who allowed him near you. His hand brushed the papers beside him like sealing an agreement. And Dante will ensure there's a perimeter. We'll make sure he is in a position to harass anyone else. Dante's nod was efficient. It held the promise of action without spectacle. I felt a wash of relief, and beneath it, a disquiet that settled like an old bruise. Will there be consequences? I asked. I needed the moral framing. I needed to know if this made me complicit in bypassing things that should be handled publicly. Marco's face was unreadable. For a moment, he looked like someone wearing the weight of decisions he had made before. There are always consequences, he said. There are people who will lose opportunities and people who will lose positions. Sometimes that's all justice looks like. Sometimes it's worse. He hesitated, then added, quietly, but I won't let him touch you again. There was violence implied in that sentence, and also the most tender promise not to touch. It was an odd locus of alarms and warmth. I slept in the penthouse that night, for the first time in months. If sleeping over a thing you called sleep could be counted. My dreams were jagged. I woke with images of hands, David's pushing and grabbing, Marco's holding, 1,000 small human hands passing me like props. In daylight, the apartment looked like a place I could inhabit without fear. In the wash of morning light, everything softened. Marco's shadow on the floor made me feel smaller and protected, like someone had drawn a boundary around me with a steady hand. Days passed that blurred into each other. The doctor's instructions repeated like prayers. Hydrate, rest, avoid alcohol, return if symptoms worsen. Dante checked in. Marco sent messages that were at once protective and oddly possessive. He asked trivial things in the tone of someone making lists. Notify HR that you'll be out for a week. Have Dante pick up your things from the office. We'll transfer your files. Practicalities. Yes. Also, controlled. He told HR he would be overseeing my transition personally. He spoke to them with that soft authority that rearranged policies. The department head called me later to offer a promotion and a new title that would nominally remove me from David's orbit. An email went out, a perfunctory memo that made the transfer of David to a faraway satellite office read like a normal staffing decision. No one used the word punishment. It was wrapped in the language of corporate mobility. I watched David's name move from my calendar like a vanishing point. I felt relief like a physical thing in my ribs. But I also felt guilt scramble through me like a small animal. The city had a mechanism for justice, and we had sidestepped it. I told myself it was pragmatic. I told myself I had to live now. I told myself that justice could wait for a more reasoned tribunal. But late at night, when the penthouse hummed and the city stretched indifferent under glass, I wondered what it had cost. Mako and I fell into a fragile rhythm. He kept his distance in public and closed it in private. He would arrive unannounced with coffee at just the time my chest tightened. Or he would appear in the doorway with a beard of shadow and ask if I wanted him to arrange for fresh linens. He argued with my employers on my behalf and then, in private, watched me as if measuring me for something he couldn't name. He once said, casually, "I've been watching you," and I felt something cold and warm at once. The words landed like a pair of gloves, protectively fitting and slightly suffocating. He clarified. "Not like that," he said, seeing the recoil. "Not with intent to. With eyes used to knowing where risks are. You were exposed." I noticed. He had noticed. That admission felt like trespass and salvation at the same time. When he explained, he spoke of the ways powerful men collect information, the way other men collect stamps, methodically, without sentiment. He was not apologetic. He was precise. "I noticed patterns," he said. "I saw who lingered near you at the wrong times. I keep records. That's how I make sure people who hurt others stay away." The narrative of a guardian needing surveillance is an old one, and I felt the pull of those words. Part of me was grateful. Part of me breathed. Being watched in order to be safe is a complicated exchange. You surrender a measure of privacy for the promise of not being hurt. I had to ask myself if I was ready to barter away that part of me. There were small mercies. He did not demand gratitude. He did not demand immediate affection. He brought me a leather-bound notebook and insisted I write down things I wanted in my life. Boundaries, yes, but also desires. He clapped once, lightly, when I wrote travel on a whim, and tapped the city map, as if deciding where to take me. He would leave without fuss, and then return with a file of my old assignments and a new title, Director of Corporate Analysis. The title felt heavy and light at once. It gave me official power and made me adjacent to him in a way that offered protection but also tethered me. There were moments of proximity that seared and unsettled me. His hand on the small of my back as he guided me through the penthouse, the way his fingers brushed my forearm when he passed me a file. Each contact left a ring of heat on my skin like a coin pressed into dough. My body remembered touch as both comfort and something else, an old, unsorted registry of safety and violation. I found myself cataloging those moments, trying to separate what was kindness from what was control. One afternoon, after a week of rest and daily check-ins, the doctor re-examined me. She smiled small, professional when she told me the concussion symptoms were subsiding. "You can return to work partially," she said. "You should avoid heavy travel for a bit. No alcohol for another week. Psychologically, continue to see a counselor." "Is there any medical reason I can't be intimate?" I asked, because it seemed like a ridiculous question wrapped in a necessary one. Intimacy felt like an instrument that needed tuning. After the violence I had absorbed, I needed to be sure my body wouldn't betray me. I needed to be sure I was making choices with full capacity. The doctor looked at me with a patience that bordered on compassion. She explained the difference between physical healing and emotional readiness. "Physically, you can consent," she said, "but consent is more than physiology. It is clarity, choice, and lack of coercion. Whatever you decide should be something you want, not something you feel obligated to accept after being saved." Her words were like a cool hand on a fevered brow. They were a correction of sorts. Rescue does not create obligation. Someone can save you and still owe you nothing but space. I told Marco what she had said. He listened. He did not move. He did not offer a speech. He put his hand over mine and squeezed with a deliberate firmness. "You choose," he said. "Always." It was a promise, and promises from him carried the weight of law. I wondered how much of that promise was about tenderness and how much was about possession, disguised as care. I wondered if, in a different life, his assurances would have been read as simple devotion. In mine, they were tinged with the knowledge of what he could do if he chose not to be gentle. When the doctor cleared me more full allowing me to go back to the office under new arrangements, Marco called a meeting with HR and his own people. They arranged the paperwork for my promotion. They reconfigured my calendar so I would attend fewer large gatherings and more small strategic sessions that required a passcode and an escort. David Morrison's transfer was formalized in an email that cited restructuring. No one used the word removal. There was no public spectacle. His file was moved. My relief came wrapped in the sterile packaging of corporate language. I went back into the office with eyes that scanned for threats and a heart that beat like a bell. People smiled and then bit their tongues. Some looked relieved. Some looked irritated. But what mattered to me was simple. Walking past the copier without fear. Sitting in a meeting and presenting without watching doorways. Marco's presence was different in daylight. He rarely entered my office, preferring the soft authority of distance. When he did, he carried himself like a man who understood the architecture of being centered. He would remain just long enough to ask about misaligned reports or to make a suggestion about a file name, and then he'd leave, the pressure of his attention still warm on my shoulders. We shared meals that were quiet. We shared silences that were not empty. He told me, once, in a voice that surprised me, about a childhood in which either everything was taken money, time, trust, or everything was earned the hard way. He spoke in a way that revealed a man who had built walls and learned the measure of loyalty. He also told me, with an almost childlike simplicity, that he did not believe in the tribunal of public opinion. I fix what I can, he said. I advise others to be careful. He never said he was wholly good. He never pretended his methods were above scrutiny. And there it was, thrumming beneath everything. The contradiction. He saved me with his hands, and then spoke as if those hands deserved membership in my life. I found myself balancing gratitude and unease on a knife's edge. I did not know yet whether his protection would become a sanctuary or a cage. One night, I woke to the sound of rain against glass. The city was a smear of light. I was alone for a moment, and for the first time in weeks, the air felt like possibility instead of peril. My phone buzzed. A message from Marco. Are you okay? I sat up and stared at the single line. The impulse to reply with humor, no. I'm fabulous, thanks, faded. I typed, I'm okay. Thank you for everything. His reply came. Come downstairs. Dante has something for you. I hesitated. The penthouse felt safe. I could stay wrapped in blankets and watch television until morning came. But my feet moved of their own accord, pulling me toward the living room where Marco stood by the window, like a sentinel. He turned when I entered. The city light cut the outline of him into a silhouette. You're restless, he observed. I'm thinking, I said. He smiled. Good. It's important to choose when you have choices. He handed me a small envelope. Inside was the official letter, confirming my promotion and a set of keys. They were not just keys to an office. They were keys that opened a path I had not expected to accept. Do you want this? He asked. It was as if the world had been divided into two columns before this and after. Before, I had been small and careful, salaried and cautious. After, I could be something else, more visible, more powerful, and inexplicably closer to a man who kept dossiers and exits. I held the keys and felt their cold weight. I thought about the night in the conference room and his hands around me. I thought about the way he had arranged the world until my immediate safety was assured. I thought about David's name sliding off my calendar and the sting of that vanishing. Yes, I said finally, I want this. He nodded, the motion decisive. Then, it's yours. He moved closer, and the space between us became a charged thing, electric and dangerous. He reached for my hand. His fingers closed around mine, and there was a firmness there that felt like both an anchor and a claim. He did not say yours as a possessive exclamation. He said it as if making an arrangement. I'll make sure no one harms you in my house, he said. And in return, you will let me know when you need distance. We have to make rules, Ivy. We make rules so both of us survive. I had the urge then to assert my own rule. I am not property. I am not a thing to be kept. I opened my mouth and swallowed the retort. Instead, I said, I will tell you. He smiled. and in the way his mouth tilted I read something else in. Admission of his own limitations. He was powerful but not omniscient. He could promise protection but not absolution. He could be a salve for immediate wounds, not the therapist who would repair the deeper scars. That night, I watched him from across the room. He moved through his house with a familiarity that made me think he had been raised in rooms like this, rooms with windows that looked down on the city and doors that closed around secrets. He left me alone to my sleep, to my bruised body and the fragile thread of safety he had extended. I accepted it, tentatively. I did not know where the thread would lead. When I fell asleep, I dreamed of hands again. This time, they were not only catching, they were choosing whether to let go. If this story reaches you, and you like narratives like this, if you want more of these morally tangled tales, please subscribe and tell me where you're listening from. I read every note. I read every city. The days that followed felt like an education. I learned to navigate my new title and the odd intimacy that grew around it. I learned that Marco's generosity was always complicated with the scent of ownership. He never hit me with his hands, never made me feel less than my own agency. But he did insist on certain terms that protected me. Yes, and also put me in a proximity that made it impossible not to notice everything about him. The slope of his jaw, the scar at his temple, the way his hands flexed when he held a pen. There was one afternoon when I arrived at the office and found a small thing on my desk, a photograph of the conference room, taken from the back, with a soft note on the bottom. It was the photo the doctor had taken for documentation, printed and delivered by Dante. The note read, "For when you forget that you were brave." I touched the paper. It was ordinary. It was proof. It was a reminder that even when you are small in the eyes of others, you have been large enough to endure. I folded the photo and put it in my wallet next to a card with my new title. I felt both bolstered and exposed. A week after returning to work, I received an invitation. Marco wanted me to attend a private dinner at his new office, a place far removed from corporate gloss. I recognized the code. To be invited into a man's private quarters, especially a man like Marco, meant something. It meant intimacy, by degrees. A negotiation of spaces. It meant he wanted to see me outside the curated light of the boardroom. I almost declined. Prudence argued for distance, but something inside me, a mix of curiosity, gratitude, and the reckless hunger we both tuck into our private places, nudged me to accept. That evening, I dressed in simple clothes. I don't own a lot of what the magazines call power pieces. My wardrobe is practical, folded by seasons and budgets and priorities. I wore a blouse that felt like armor and trousers that reminded me I could stand straight. When I arrived, Marco greeted me at the door. He took my hand in his, not with the possessiveness of a man claiming, but with the collegiality of one who wished to honor the agreement between us. "Thank you for coming," he said. He led me inside. Dinner was straightforward, no theatrics. Just good food and careful conversation. We talked about reports and projections. We joked once about the ridiculousness of corporate wellness memos. The conversation circled and deepened, like a river moving under ice. At one point, he stood to refill our wine. The glass was sent back to me when the doctor had said to avoid alcohol, but the gesture itself felt like an invitation, embroidered with choice. He set the glass down and folded his hands. "I know you're angry sometimes," he said, almost as if continuing a thought. "At me? At what happened? At the world. That's healthy. I don't want you to feel obligated." "Obligated to what?" I asked. "To me," he said simply. The table hummed with the ambient sound of the city below. I looked at him and saw, with a clarity that surprised me, a man who had made a life out of making hard decisions. He could order and rearrange, yes, but he couldn't coerce desire. He could not make me feel less frightened by the past. He couldn't erase what David had done. All he could do was stand under my falling and keep his hands ready. "Do you want me here because I'm safe?" I asked, because the question needed to be spoken aloud. His eyes softened. "I want you here because I want you, and because I believe I can keep you from being hurt again. But if you ever tell me that this is too much, or this is no good, I'll step back." I will. I will never force you to stay. His words should have been enough. They were not a magic bomb, but they were a promise, and promises are a kind of scaffolding. I decided, in that moment, to climb them carefully. After dinner, when the city dimmed and the lights in Marco's office burned like small moons, he walked me to the door. His hand found mine. It fit like it was made to map mine. He inclined his head, and for a moment I saw a man who could have been my rescuer or my captor, depending on how the hours ahead lined up. He hesitated, then spoke again. I know my life is not ordinary. I've asked a lot of you already. You saved me, I said. He looked at me with an odd mixture of relief and something like hunger. I did, he admitted, and I would do it again. The confession settled between us like a small purikari as furema. I felt its warmth and risk both. That night, I lay in the penthouse and thought about the shape of obligations. I reminded myself of the doctor's caution. Decisions made in the aftermath of rescue must be revisited with clarity, not only with gratitude. I told myself to be vigilant about what I surrendered. Yet as sleep finally took me, I couldn't help the small, corrupting thought that there was a kind of tenderness in being caught. There is a poetry to hands that know exactly how to hold you without hurting you. There is a fear in that poetry too, because hands can close. He left me with a promise and a set of keys. I held both like objects I needed to learn how to keep. The city hummed below, and above that hum was a question that settled into my bones like an ache. Was protection by a man like him salvation, or the beginning of a different captivity? The answer was not mine to give in a single night. It would arrive in pieces, in conversations, in small acts, in boundaries kept or crossed. It would arrive in the way he responded when I demanded space, and the way I responded when I felt soulless. And so I learned, in those early days, to measure him in increments. The way he entered a room, the way his hands rested on a menu, the way he left me a folded note on my desk that read, bluntly, be careful. There was a beat when he added, more softly, and if you ever want to leave, I will open the door wider than you think. I held that line in my head for a long time. It swelled and shrank like something alive. It was tender and it was terrifying. It was the core of the bargain we were forming. It was an invitation and a test. When the week stretched into 2, and the doctor signed off enough of my clearance that I could imagine returning to some version of normal, Dante reported back, with the quiet clarity of soldiers who had completed orders. David Morrison had been transferred to a subsidiary office across the state. His files had been reassigned. Internally, the language around his move was impenetrable. Externally, he would be out of my daily orbit. I was safe, if safe can be measured by absence. And yet, as my life reassembled itself in new shapes, new title, new apartment keys, new small rituals, a different kind of wanting crept in. It wasn't a demand, it was a curiosity. What did it mean to be cared for by someone who inhabited the shadow line between legality and the ways of the world? Could I trust a man whose hands could catch me and also push others away? Could I keep my agency intact while allowing another to occupy a continuous, protective space in my life? Those questions would not be answered in the hush between rescue and recovery. They were for later, for the slow testing that comes after the immediate crisis is past. For now, there was a house that no longer felt like a fortress, and a man who remained an enigma. I sat with the ambiguity because it felt like the only honest place to be. And yet, even in the waiting, the city taught me one thing. Most of our decisions are not between extremes. They are between shades. They are about choosing which of a dozen lesser evils to live with so we can keep enough of ourselves to someday be whole again. He left the light on in the living room and closed the door softly behind him. I lay awake and thought about the meeting room floor, the sound of my pen falling, the image of his hands wide and sure beneath my arms. I thought about the way he had rearranged things without making a show of it. I thought about the man I was becoming under his watchful presence, less a victim, perhaps, but also entangled. Sometimes you have to fall to discover who will catch you. I had been caught. The question that came now was whether I would stay in the net or climb back out and make my own way. I let the question of staying or leaving live in my chest like an ache for days. It didn't resolve itself with one decision. Instead, It unspooled in small, ordinary moments. The way Marco left the kettle on so the water would be ready when I woke. The way Dante slid a fresh notepad onto my desk as if to remind me I still had work to do. The way I caught myself breathing easier when I realized a stranger in the elevator no longer made my hands go cold. Each of those small mercies stacked up like stones until they formed a path I could walk on without constantly checking for traps. Recovery, I learned, is not a straight line. There were afternoons when a flash of memory would split the present and I would feel as raw as the first day. On those days, I honored the doctor's instruction and I let the therapist's voice guide me slow breathing, naming sensations, acknowledging shame without letting it define me. On better days, I focused on spreadsheets and meetings and the awkwardness of being newly titled. The promotion had come with responsibilities I wanted to meet on their own terms. I had worked for a career. I did not want that work to become simply a backdrop for someone else's story about me. Marco, predictably, complicated everything. He continued to orbit my life with a peculiar mix of discretion and insistence. He would show up with soup when I worked late and then linger in the dark, asking nothing. He made small, deribere togeschassu, replacing a burned-out bulb in my apartment himself. Returning a book I'd left on his coffee table that felt like punctuation marks to an argument we hadn't yet finished making. He never demanded more than I offered, and that restraint mattered. But neither did he pretend all of this was ordinary. One late afternoon, about 3 weeks after the fall, he came to my office during an afternoon session. He stood at the threshold, hands in his pockets, the light slanting across his face so that you couldn't quite read him. He had a way of asking for entrance without asking at all. "You okay?" he said when he reached my desk. It was practical. It was the same question the doctor asked, and I appreciated the simplicity of it. "Are you getting what you need here?" I hesitated. "I am," I said slowly. "But it's complicated." He smiled without teeth. "Everything worthwhile is either complicated or dangerous," he said. "Sometimes both." He pulled up a chair and sat. For a while we talked about budgets and performance metrics, like two co-workers keeping the conversation safely abstract. Then he leaned forward, elbows on knees, eyes steady. "I want to know when the quiet isn't you," he said. "When you are pretending. I don't want to be the reason you silence yourself." I felt a surge of something that was part gratitude, part alarm. "I'm not pretending to be fine to make you feel better," I said. "I'm pretending to be fine because it helps me function." "That's adulting," he said, then softer. "And it can hide things that matter." The frankness in his voice forced me to be frank in return. "I appreciate what you've done," I told him. "I just also need to know that the protection isn't a way of owning me." He looked at his hands, the thick fingers I had once thought of as simply capable. "I don't want to own you," he said. "I want you near me, because I want you. That doesn't mean I won't be dangerous. It only means I'll try to be gentle." There was the wording, a Gina qualification layered over a promise. It was honest. It was the kind of truth I could work with. It wasn't an apology for what he was or what he did. It was an orientation toward something that might, with care, become less threatening. The weeks that followed folded into a quiet domesticity. We found our rhythms. He arranged for a counselor to take my insurance. Gentle persistence like a man who knew the power of convenience. He made sure I had reliable transportation home after late meetings. Dante's check-ins became less militarized and more human. He would text to ask if the curtains at my place needed mending, or my apartment needed a handyman. It felt, in small ways, like the edges of my former life were being stitched back together. There were moments of violation in the way he could move the world without me. Decisions made in rooms I would never enter. But there were also moments of discretion. He did not call my colleagues to announce himself. He arranged my schedule through HR with the subtlety of someone who understood optics. When I discovered a file on my desk with his initials, it contained nothing but notes and calendars, nothing invasive. Yet one evening, curiosity and an urge to understand the man who had steadied me pushed me past the line of politeness. We were in his study, the city spread below like liquid amber. He had a glass of something on the table, and a pen behind his ear, as if he might sign a check or summon a favor at any moment. He looked older when he thought he wasn't being watched. There were thin lines at the corners of his eyes and a small, pale seam of a scar that ran up his temple. It made him look like he'd been catalogued by enough battles to know how much to defend. "Tell me how you learned to keep people safe," I asked. It felt risky, like asking a surgeon to reveal an instrument's edge. "Tell me where that came from." He sat back and exhaled, a soft noise that might have been a laugh if you believe in laws of economy for breath. "I grew up in places where favors cost less than loyalty," he said. "You learn to move people without asking. You learn to watch. You learn to step in where the law is lazy. It's not always right. I've paid for a lot of it in ways that didn't look like money." "What did you pay?" I asked, because I had to know whether his ledger included more than debts. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he touched the rim of his glass and watched it catch light. "People I loved left," he said finally. "People I couldn't protect because I believed power was the same as love. It isn't. It's a blunt instrument. I learned, too late, that the one thing I couldn't buy was the trust of the people I wanted to keep." The confession landed like a stone. It made him less frightening and more human, which complicated my gratitude. If he'd made mistakes in the past, maybe he could choose differently now. If he had lost people he loved because he confused control with care, maybe he had lessons to inform his gentleness. Or maybe he'd merely learned different methods for the same underlying need. That night I slept better than I had in weeks. Not because the city hummed less, but because the man whose hands had caught me had shown a fracture as well as a capability. Our relationship continued to evolve under a series of small tests. There was the time a board member suggested that my promotion owed more to who I was with than what I'd earned. I felt old, burned, and small. Marco responded by sending an understated note to the department head insisting on the quality of work metrics that had justified me. Later, when I asked him why he had handled it that way, he said simply, "Because you shouldn't have to fight that battle on top of everything else." There was the time I found, in a drawer, a small surveillance log Dante kept. My first instinct was to fling it across the room and demand privacy. My second was to read it, like someone reading their own medical chart. It was meticulous and utilitarian. It listed comings and goings, times and patterns, names and places, almost bureaucratic in its dryness. When I confronted him, Marco did not deny it. He explained, "It's a risk register. It helps me see where a problem might start. I keep it to mitigate harm. If it bothers you, I will burn it." I did not ask him to burn it. I asked him to share access, to let me know what was collected and why. That conversation nudged something crucial into place. We began drafting boundaries together, awkward and honest. He learned what I found invasive and what I considered reasonable. I learned how to ask without sounding accusatory. It was a workmanlike intimacy. It built trust, the way houses are built beam by beam. And then, one ordinary afternoon that felt suddenly large, the doctor who had overseen my recovery asked for a follow-up. We were in a clinical room with paper draped over the exam table and the too familiar smell of disinfectant, the kind when you remember every time you've been wounded. Her examination was efficient. She asked about sleep and appetite and the intrusive thoughts that sometimes came uninvited. She checked my reflexes, my heart, the steadying of my gait. She scrawled notes, considered them, and then unexpectedly smiled. "You're doing well," she said. "Really? The cognitive tests are back in a good place. The bruising has resolved. Physically, you're cleared for full activity. Emotionally, you're on a healthy trajectory. Therapy is helping. There will be setbacks, that's normal, but you are no longer in a fragile state." I would later remember how the doctor's words felt like a key in a lock. They didn't fix everything, but they unlatched a possibility. I thought of what full activity might include. The question I had been holding in my throat for weeks about desire and choice was suddenly permissible, to speak without the compulsion of crises. After the appointment, we drove back to the penthouse in silence. The city rolled by, indifferent. Marco parked and stayed in the car for a long time, hands folded in his lap as if he were rehearsing the right thing to say. When he opened his door, he motioned for me to stay. He walked around and sat close to me, the air between us warm with unspoken negotiation. "I asked her because I wanted to be certain," he said. Not explanation, but accountability. I won't ever let you mistake care for ownership. I asked because if you and I are ever to be more than this, I want it to be because you want it. I am not going to take advantage of a window where you're vulnerable. I looked at him really. And I saw, under the armor, someone attempting to be ethical about his own impulses. That didn't erase his faults. It did, however, offer a chance for me to answer honestly. There's a difference between choosing because you were saved and choosing because you want to stay, I said. I need to be sure this is my wanting. Then tell me what you want, he said, voice low. Tell me what feels like too much. Tell me a way to love you that doesn't feel like a claim. It wasn't a demand for whitened consent. It was an invitation, dangerous and rare. I thought of the week in the conference room, the doctor's steady hands, the look on Marco's face when he said he wouldn't let me be hurt again. I thought of the nights I woke with my hands clutched to my chest. The nights when I could tell he was awake on the other side of the room. I thought of small acts. Him leaving a thermos of tea on my nightstand. Dante's gentle check-in texts. The way Marco bowed his head when I said the word no and meant it. What I want, I said, is honesty and patience and rules. I listed them slowly, as if drafting a contract. I want someone who will listen when I say stop. I want someone who will accept not tonight without bargaining. I want to be able to leave, and to be heard when I say that. I want therapy to continue, and I want to decide without pressure if I want to bring someone into my bed. He listened, like a man cataloging a treasure. You will have all of that, he said, and whatever I do, you'll know it, no secrets. If I cross a line, tell me to leave the room. If I don't listen, Dante will step in. We'll put safeguards in place. It felt like the only reasonable response to outline protections, as if our budding intimacy were a fragile operation. The formality of it lessened the romance and increased the safety. It also made the desire that lived beneath the rules more real, because it meant it would be chosen, not seized. So we made rules. Small, practical measures that had the ring of someone learning to love without claiming. Marco agreed to ask, before he arranged anything that affected my schedule. I insisted he limit surveillance of my private spaces and accept that he could not make unilateral decisions about someone else's career without my consent. We agreed to let my therapist be informed, with my permission, of any significant changes in my living arrangements. We wrote it down with a pen on a napkin and burnt the paper afterward like a ritual. The night we finally crossed that boundary, it felt less like a leap and more like a decision made after consultation. There was no flash of cinematic temptation, no thunderstorm or black tie affair to excuse a sudden collapse into one another. Instead, the evening was gentle, almost mundane. We ate dinner quietly, laughed over something small, and then sat with coffee and a dessert neither of us touched. May I? Marco asked, his voice the gentlest command he had ever given. He did not need to ask. He had already done so, but the simple question on explicit request for consent landed between us like a hinge. It was the sound of a man practicing gentleness. Yes, I said, yes, you may. Then he did something I'd wanted and feared in equal measure. He let the rest of the world recede and focused on me with an intensity that was not possessive but present. His hands, the hands that had saved me, now moved with a different knowledge. They stayed slow. He touched my jawline with reverence, mapping the bone as a cartographer might map a shoreline. He traced the faint scar behind my ear, that mark that had once been exposed to the boardroom light, and he did so as if cataloging the fact of me, not claiming it. We were careful. He checked the bottle on the coffee table and then looked at me. Are you sure? He asked. I'm sure, I said. The words were crisp. They were not an excuse for gratitude, they were a clear choice. When our mouths met, it was like a place remembered and a map being redrawn at once. It was an admission of need, not a remedy for the past. We moved slowly, with a deliberation that felt like a conversation rather than a seizure. He asked before he kissed. He asked before he undid buttons. He paused at every sign of hesitation and waited until I gave the small, firm permission that meant go on. There was tenderness and desire braided together. There was nothing erratic or violent. Nothing that erased the weeks of recovery. Afterward, we lay side by side and talked in the way people talk when something sacred has been made ordinary. Sometimes I fear I'll take everything I want because I can, he said. Especially when I think of what I've been able to do. I don't want this to be another of those things. I want you because of you. You could have taken my silence, too, I replied. You had the power to manipulate the situation. You could have made me feel obliged. You didn't. That counts. We promised to keep checking in with each other. We promised to keep therapy appointments and to let transparency be the mortars between us. We didn't speak of forever. We spoke of the next day, the next week, the next month, concrete timeframes, because those were manageable and real. Life after that night was both familiar and shifted. Intimacy introduced new pressures, tiny calibrations that required humility. There were mornings when I woke with the uncanny sensation of being seen in a way that left me exposed. There were arguments, small and large. Once, after a difficult day, I snapped at him for rearranging a meeting without consulting me. He listened, apologized, and then explained why he'd acted on misjudgment. He admitted, I accepted the apology, but I also insisted on accountability. He accepted it. That acceptance mattered. At work, the practical consequences of what had been done to me continued to unfold. David's transfer held. He filed a complaint, citing procedural errors, and for a time the office hummed with low anxiety. I met with HR and gave a statement that documented my account. The company navigated the messy legal middle ground. No spectacular firing. No televised confession, just a quiet reshuffling that cost someone a career and left a bruise on an institution's integrity. I wrestled with guilt over that. It is difficult to be the beneficiary of extrajudicial remedies and not feel implicated. Marco had used his reach. That was true. He had moved people and made doors close quietly. I tried to separate what I'd needed, the immediate removal of a threat, from what he'd chosen to do without my full command. They were not the same thing. I had asked to be protected. I hadn't asked for someone else's life to be rearranged to an unknown degree. That ethical tension sat with me like a glass half full, beautiful, useful, and fragile. Marco was aware of that tension. He never celebrated the reordered calendar. He listened to my misgivings and told me, as he had from the beginning, that power without conscience is a danger. I will live with the consequences of what I do, he told me once. And I will accept when I am wrong. He said it more than once, like a pledge against the easier route of rationalization. There were other consequences too. The man who had once smirked at jokes in the corridor had colleagues who whispered about favors and influence. Rumors, like mildew, spread. Some people were uncomfortable with the proximity between a company owner and a promoted director. There were whispers that I had been advanced for reasons other than competence. Those rumors stung in a way I could not fully explain. They were another kind of bruise, one that hurt only in the places where pride had begun to regrow. I learned to let the work speak for itself. I refused to be defensive in public about the reasons for my promotion. I leaned into meetings, into numbers, into the kind of competence that cannot be discounted by gossip. Marco, for his part, kept his interventions private. He did not put his hand on the scale for vanity. He did it for containment. That wasn't absolution. It was a fact to be acknowledged. We moved in together 6 months after the fall, gradually, like the way a tide finds its level. I did not uproot my life overnight. I kept my apartment for a while, a place that held the smell of my cheap laundry detergent and the echo of alone time. But the penthouse, with its high windows and the city spread like a promise below, became a place where my things accumulates and my routines built. We purchased small items together, a rug that he insisted on because he thought it would soften the sound of footsteps, things that felt like slow investments in a shared proprietorship that was not ownership but coexistence. The mornings were the best. We moved around each other with the kind of care that emerges from people who have once learned to bruise easily. He made coffee a certain way that became a ritual I began to like. Noticing the little things that revealed character. The way he read the morning paper and cursed under his breath at an unfair article. The way he left notes on my bedside table, reminding me to take the long view. The way his thumb would tap a rhythm against the counter when he was thinking. Love, when it arrived, was not a thunderclap. It was a series of choices that accumulated gravity. There were nights he cooked and we laughed at burnt onions. There were quiet afternoons when he would bring me tea and not ask for anything in return. There were still moments of fear, my body responding to a sudden shout in a film with a spike of adrenaline, my head filling with images that belonged to someone else's brutality. But in the repair, I also found pleasure. A hand that cupped my face and waited. A partner who asked before proceeding. A man whose possessiveness became less the shutter and more the window. One evening, long after the initial crisis, we sat on the balcony and watched the city lights blink like a pattern we could learn. I turned to him, thinking of all the ways we had survived the first phase. "Do you regret anything?" I asked quietly. He considered for a long time, then shrugged, a small, haunted movement. "I regret the ways I've made other people pay for my mistakes," he said. "I regret that I didn't know how to separate protection from possession sooner. Sometimes I wonder if my methods make me worse than the problems I try to solve." "It's complicated," I said. "You saved me. You also used methods that hurt others. Those things can be true at once." He nodded. "That's why I don't want us to be an example of my power," he said. "I want us to be an example of something better. Not perfect, but chosen." Chosen, I repeated. The word had weight now. It was not about being taken. It was about choosing to stay, to keep working on ourselves, to accept the messy ledger of consequence. I admit, some nights I still woke in the dark, reaching for a phantom support that wasn't there. There were angry dreams and moments when shame crept in and tried to make me small again. But other nights I slept with my face turned toward the warmth of someone who knew how to be careful. And in the waking, I found myself saying his name like an incantation of safety, and not as proof of weakness. We did not pretend that everything was neat. Mako had enemies, people who resented his reach, people who had been burned by favors he'd withheld or given. There were moments when the reality of his other life intruded, a call that made his face hard, a driver who refused to take a route he wanted, a voice that thanked him for a favor he had done in secret. Those intrusions reminded me that the man who had held me might, in other contexts, be someone who made choices I'd not endorse. One night, after a menacing letter arrived at the penthouse, an anonymous threat that Marco's people quickly traced but did not publicly highlight, he sat down and told me everything he was willing to tell about the cost of being who he was. He explained the trade-offs, the lives he'd had to shape to maintain a position, the bones of cruelty he had sometimes used, like mortars. He did not excuse himself, he told me, and listening to him was like seeing the underside of a machine. Familiar parts, sharp gears, a moral engine that sometimes ran on questionable ethics. "I don't expect you to love everything about me," he said. "I only ask that you see the whole of me, flaws and the capacity for better, and decide if you can live with that." I thought of the alternatives, the lonely map of my previous life, the long, dry years of caution. I thought of the safety that had been woven into my days, the doctor, the therapist, the calendar rearranged so I could breathe. I thought of the way he'd caught me, of the steadiness of those hands, and of the way they had learned to be tender. "I can see you," I said, "and I can hold you to your promises. I can ask for accountability. I can also choose to stay." That evening, we did not exchange vows. We set no marker that would make the world speak in a term like forever. We made plans, small and practical, a shared health plan for therapy, a phone code for emergencies, a list of lines that would not be crossed. It wasn't romantic in the way novels promise, but it was real in the way people who have been hurt and saved sometimes need. Realistic, ethical, cautious, nourishing. Months later, when a friend asked me if I had regrets about the way things had started, my answer was honest and unmasked. "I regret being hurt," I said. "I regret the choices I had to make to get safe. I also regret that someone who could help me had the kind of power that made help morally ambiguous. But I don't regret finding people who stayed with me as I recovered." "And Marco?" she asked. I thought of the man who had held me when I fell, who had negotiated protection with quiet ferocity, who had learned to ask rather than take. "He loves me in his way," I said. "That love is complicated and imperfect. So am I. Maybe that's the point." The city outside moved on. People who had watched the original incident whispered in corners and then moved on to something else. The news cycle had more sensational items to feed on. In the quiet, life rebuilt itself. My promotion solidified into genuine authority. I learned to trust my voice at meetings. Marco learned to let me have fights without interceding. Dante learned to be patient with my boundaries. On the morning we signed a lease for a smaller place, our compromise between his sprawling penthouse and my solitary apartment. We drank coffee in 2 chipped mugs and laughed at the absurdity of deciding which books to keep. He reached across the table and squeezed my hand in a gesture that had nothing to do with power. It was a simple pressure that said, without words, I am with you. Sometimes, when I think about that day in the conference room, the memory is shockingly clear. The scrape of my palms against the table, the flash of fluorescent light, the sound like breaking glass in my head, and then, more vividly than anything, those hands. Big, capable hands that closed around me and didn't let go. I have asked myself what that catching meant. Was it rescue? Yes. Was it the beginning of a dependency? Sometimes. Was it the start of something that could be built into genuine partnership? Possibly. The truth is, both smaller and larger than any easy moral. That people can be both saving and dangerous. That rescue does not remove obligation. That love can be complicated and require hard work. So I keep asking questions. I keep therapy appointments. I keep making rules. I keep choosing, again and again, to inhabit this life because of the ways I can grow inside it, not because I was rescued into it. Marco does the same. He learns to restrain the parts of himself that would take by force what he can get by care. He admits faults. He pays in the currency of changed behavior and small reparations. If you read this and find yourself wondering whether it was right for me to accept his help, to accept him, please. No, I understand that doubt. It sits in me still, like a shadow that wants to be named. Was Marco justified in bypassing formal channels? He did what he did because I asked him to protect me in a way that the system, as I knew it, would not. Did his methods have ethical cost? Yes. Would I choose the same in hindsight? I cannot answer that for everyone. All I can say is the choice I made was complicated, painful, and ultimately rooted in a need to survive and to reclaim my work and my life. So what do you think? Was he right to act as he did to keep me safe? Was I wrong to accept? Is protection from someone like him a salvation or a compromise? Tell me where you're listening from and leave your thoughts below. Read every comment. If you want more stories dissecting messy choices and slow-burning consequences, like and subscribe.